I want to use a couple of analogies to explain the way that this course is set up. And the first is a menorah. I'm not Jewish and I don't have a menorah to use as an illustration, but a menorah is a 7-candle candelabra used to celebrate the Feast of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is 7 days long, and you light one candle each day of the festival so that by the end of the feast, the entire candelabra is giving forth light. I suppose that this festival is designed to celebrate the coming of the divine light into the world. In this course, though, we want to use the candelabra as a way of describing or illustrating the history of philosophy, or the philosophy of history. If you're not familiar with it, you might think that the history of philosophy is a succession of events, a succession of thoughts and of thinkers who gave way to one another so that we would read one text and move on to another. In fact, of course, we will read in a more or less chronological method throughout this course, but we want to do it in a way that leaves open, leaves on the illumination from the earlier thinkers to light our way as we go forward. That is, the history of philosophy is more like a menorah than it is like a succession of events, because the light from Plato's text is still shining for us today, and when successive thinkers come along, it's not as though they replace or negate or cancel out the thinking that has gone before. Rather, they add to it, they contribute, they give us more and more insight, if you will. They allow us to see the same subject of investigation from a variety of perspectives. I suppose that this analogy works for the way that we'll hold discussions in this course as well. We want to listen to one another. We want to learn from one another without too much quibbling about who has the better perspective on what we're discussing. A second analogy that I want to use is that of the modern book. Maybe you know this. The modern book was the invention of, or the descendant from, the early Christian church. Prior to the 1st century, if you had an important document, a sacred text that you wanted kept over a long period of time, you didn't write it in a book, you wrote it on a scroll. That was how you preserved something important. They had codexes, something like a loosely bound notebook that they would record things like lists and other kinds of things that didn't need to be preserved for very long. But sacred texts, for absolutely sure, were recorded in scrolls. The early church, though, maybe because many of them were poor, found that the codex, or this notebook, what has become for us today the book, was a better way for them to access the ancient texts and the modern texts at the same time, to cross-reference between what they called the Old Testament and what they called the New Testament, to leaf in the same sermon from the Gospel or an epistle from the Apostle Paul back into the law and the prophets, and to bring these texts together into an innovative and creative way. There are a lot of good ways for us to work with texts, but what we want to do is to keep them open before us in such a way that the different texts that we have read, the texts that we are reading now, interact with one another, illuminate one another, and give us more and more insight. Maybe you've had this experience when you've been studying or writing a paper, that your desk becomes cluttered with many books that are all open and active. At the beginning of this course, we're going to open and read Book 1 of Homer's Iliad. And then we're going to read the few pages of fragments from Heraclitus's book. But we don't want then to close the book on Homer. We want rather Homer's book to remain open throughout the course to illuminate our insights into the succeeding texts. We're going to read the Symposium by Plato, and then we're going to look into the 11th book of Augustine's Confessions. We're going to glance at the Meditations on First Philosophy by René Descartes. We're going to read carefully Time and the Other by Emmanuel Levinas. And we're going to end the course by reading To Be Born by Luisa Irigaray. That's a lot of texts and a cumbersome amount of material to work with, which is why I've provided us with a class reader. In less than 200 pages, we have the entirety of these texts here that we're going to read together. But like the scriptures of the Christian church, one that we can leaf back and forth within, one that we can annotate for ourselves, one where we can cross-reference the early texts from the history of philosophy with Irigaray's text written only a few years ago now. My hope is that the class reader is more than just a material resource for research. My hope is that it's also an image, an allegory, a metaphor for the way that we want to think in a philosophy course. We want to think for ourselves, but also with an open mind toward the thinking of others. We want to keep these texts open before us in such a way that they interact with our own thinking. We want to listen to the insights of classmates so that we truly learn, not refuting them in argumentation, but wrestling with them toward a common goal. When we study the texts of philosophy, we don't study to find out what Plato said in the past tense. We study the texts of Plato in order to understand and to decide for ourselves what we think ourselves today. Or anyway, that's the ideal that we should aspire toward.